The storm came like a thief swift, merciless, and without warning. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the lonely silhouette of a man fighting his way through mud and chaos. His face streaked with rain and determination. Each gust of wind carried with it fragments of the past, broken promises, and dreams set aside. In his hands were tools worn by generations, symbols of quiet heroism forged in grease and sweat, now gripped tighter against the roaring darkness. Far behind him, in a small garage, shadows stirred anxiously beneath the flickering light of a single bulb. A woman sat tense, eyes glancing toward the storm, her secrets heavier than the silence filling the room. Beside her stood a young woman, defiant yet uncertain, fingers trembling slightly as thunder rattled the walls. Outside, the tempest howled, echoing the turmoil within each heart, a storm of regrets, redemption, and desperate hope. Fate had brought them together, but it would take more than courage to withstand the coming trials. Tonight, beneath this brutal sky, everything was about to change. And soon a choice would be made between surrendering to the darkness or rising to reclaim what had long been lost. Henry Townsend had lived in Rosewood County all his life, and at 62, he believed he had grown old right along with the place. His father's garage, Townsend Auto and Repairs, stood on the outskirts of the county road, a humble building of corrugated metal and memories. It wasn't a flashy establishment, but everyone in town knew Henry was the man to see if your tractor sputtered, your pickup stalled, or your old sedan rattled. He'd learned the craft from his father, Luther Townsend, who in turn had learned it from his own father. Generations of grease-stained overalls, battered toolboxes, and the unwavering belief that if you took care of people, they'd take care of you. Henry's daily routine was steeped in a mix of nostalgia and necessity. At dawn, he'd shuffle downstairs from the small apartment he kept above the garage, make himself a pot of coffee, and unlock the heavy metal doors. Sometimes, he liked to pause and let the morning sun streak through the dusty windows, illuminating rows of wrenches and socket sets. He'd think of the days long gone when his wife, June, was alive and his son, Patrick, was a restless teenager wanting to leave Rosewood County to see the world. Now, Patrick was in another state, with a family of his own. Henry rarely complained about the distance, but late at night, as he listened to the hum of the fluorescent lights, he felt that familial absence acutely. Despite the quiet sadness that sometimes filled his heart, Henry found small joys in being useful. He changed oil for free for the local seniors who lived on tight budgets. He crafted little metal braces for a young boy with a weak leg, carefully shaping the steel to align with the child's knee. Once, he'd helped a veteran named Carl fix a wheelchair ramp that had splintered. Henry had no carpentry skills, but he improvised with leftover plywood and an old steel beam, ensuring the ramp was stable for Carl's daily use. Acts of service like these gave Henry purpose. They also stirred an old, forgotten dream he had once yearned to build custom prosthetics for wounded veterans after returning from his own short stint in the military many years ago. Life, however, had other plans. His mother fell ill. His father needed help in the shop, and soon the dream got tucked away like a dusty photograph in the attic. One late afternoon, Henry was closing up early because his arthritic knees had started throbbing. The older he got, the more those war-era injuries and decades on concrete floors took their toll. That was when he heard the soft whir of a wheelchair rolling over gravel. A woman in her 50s, hair pinned neatly, wearing a worn but carefully mended jacket, was making her way toward the open doors. She was drenched from the sudden spring rain, face etched with exhaustion and something that looked like lingering pain. "Excuse me," she called out, voice quivering slightly as she maneuvered around an oil stain. I'm sorry if you're about to close, but I need help." Henry had seen that look before, the anxious hope of someone holding together the last threads of dignity. Taking a moment to gather his composure, he stepped forward and wiped his greased hands on a rag. "Ma'am," he replied in a gentle, gravelly tone, "if there's something needs fixing, I'll do my best." He offered her a seat inside the garage, noticing a broken leg rest on her chair, a contraption that seemed to be improvised from old parts. Little did he know, this unassuming arrival would upend his quiet life and awaken a dream he thought he had long buried. The woman introduced herself as Margaret Reed, a retired school teacher from 2 counties over. She spoke softly, her voice edged wet with pride that refused to yield to vulnerability. When Henry offered her a spare blanket to dry off, she insisted she was fine, even though her lips trembled slightly from the cold. In the yellowish glow of the garage's overhead lights, Henry could see that one of Margaret's legs ended just above the knee, the residual limb covered by a prosthetic that was clearly battered and outdated. The metal frame was scuffed, the joints squeaked, and the straps looked like they'd been replaced dozens of times. Margaret explained that she'd lost her leg in a car accident years back, and her insurance had only covered so much for the prosthetic. The model she had was serviceable for a time but had begun breaking down. Replacement parts were expensive, and the nearest specialized clinic was far beyond her means. She'd heard from a cousin in Rosewood County that Henry was a miracle worker who never turned away a person in need. As Henry listened to her story, he felt a stirring of both compassion and the old longing to create something more meaningful than a quick fix. He pulled a creaking stool beside her and bent down to examine the prosthetic's connections. Although Henry had repaired hundreds of vehicle parts, from transmissions to suspension systems, it had been years since he'd even looked at a medical device with the intention of refurbishing it. Still, the mechanics were not entirely alien: pistons and rods, joints and hinges, material wear, and the necessity of durability. His mind switched to that dormant dream: building prosthetics that were sturdy, affordable, and accessible to people like Margaret, who didn't have corporate insurance or big savings. Margaret watched Henry's concentration with curiosity. She'd taught science classes for decades, recognized that spark of innovation in his eyes, but she also sensed a heaviness like a man haunted by regrets. When Henry rose to his feet, favoring his aching knees, he cleared his throat as if on the verge of a momentous decision. "I can try to patch this up, Ms. Reed," he said, his tone measured. "But if you want a real solution, not just a Band-Aid fix, we might need to rebuild this from scratch." She swallowed hard, perhaps worried about the cost. I'm on a fixed income now. I'm not sure I can pay for fancy repairs." Henry raised a hand to silence her concern. "Let's not talk about money yet," he reassured. "We'll figure out a fair arrangement." He explained that he had some spare parts lying around: leftover metal rods, specialized bolts he'd salvaged, even a worn hydraulic cylinder from an old tractor project. With some ingenuity, he believed he could craft a workable leg. It wouldn't be a high-tech masterpiece, but it might offer her comfort and mobility she hadn't had in years. Margaret looked at Henry, eyes full of cautious hope. "Why would you do that for me?" she asked, voice trembling slightly. Henry paused, remembering the sense of purpose he'd once felt, designing sketches of prosthetic limbs in a battered notebook. He thought of the men he'd served with in the military who came home missing limbs, and how he'd wanted to help them, but never got the chance. "Let's just say," Henry said, keeping his voice steady, "it's a dream I laid aside a long time ago. You might be giving me a chance to pick it back up." Before Margaret could ask more, the phone rang: an elderly neighbor asking if Henry could jumpstart his truck. That was life in Rosewood County. Henry gave Margaret a warm nod. "You stay right here and rest up. I'll be back soon. We'll get started on that dream tonight." She offered him a small smile in return, perhaps not fully believing in miracles but willing to hang on to his words. And just like them, the quiet gears of Henry's world began to spin differently, setting into motion events that would forever change both their lives. Henry's granddaughter, Emily Townsend, arrived the next day unannounced, barging into the garage with a burst of fresh energy. She was a bright 20-year-old engineering student on spring break, and though she'd planned to spend her vacation traveling with friends, a family pull brought her back to Rosewood County. Emily found her grandfather hunched over a metal workbench, fussing with a cluster of steel rods and miniature springs. His posture was as stiff as the battered stools he kept around, and despite the dim overhead lighting, she saw the resolute gleam in his eyes. "Grandpa," Emily called out, her voice echoing amid the clatter of tools. Henry turned and smiled in surprise. Despite the generation gap, the two had always shared a deep bond, Emily's fascination with problem solving came from years of watching him fix anything that crossed his path. She'd been a scrawny 9-year-old in overalls, trailing him around, handing him wrenches and asking endless questions about how engines worked. Now she was studying mechanical engineering at a state university, brimming with big ideas about robotics and renewable energy. She set her backpack down and peered over his shoulder at the sketches pinned to the wall, rough outlines of a prosthetic leg, annotated with tiny notes on angles, torque, and material stress points. "What's this?" Emily asked, eyebrows rising in curiosity. Henry paused, then gave a short laugh. "You came just in time. I need an assistant who understands more of these fancy engineering formulas." He explained Margaret's situation and the dream he once had of making prosthetics for veterans. Emily listened quietly, her expression shifting from interest to empathy. Margaret, who had been napping in the makeshift lounge area, awoke and slowly wheeled herself to where Henry and Emily stood. She introduced herself to Emily, apologizing for intruding. Emily waved off the apology with a warm smile, explaining that she admired her grandfather's willingness to help and was ready to assist in any way she could. Within minutes, the two younger minds, Margaret and Emily, were in a deep discussion about material composites, weight distribution, and the complexities of stump sockets. Henry watched, feeling a spark of pride and nostalgia. It was the first time in decades he'd seen such an animated collaboration in the old garage. That night, they set about testing the viability of Henry's salvage parts. He found an old hydraulic rod originally intended for a tractor's steering mechanism, reasoning it might serve as a makeshift knee joint if carefully calibrated. Emily used her laptop to run quick stress simulations, though the software she had was rudimentary compared to professional labs. It was more advanced than Henry's mental math. Margaret offered invaluable feedback about her comfort requirements, the daily routines that stressed her prosthetic the most, and where typical models failed. They scribbled notes across scraps of paper, leaving a trail of ideas pinned to the garage walls like a detective's caseboard. Despite the flurry of excitement, the shadow of financial strain loomed. Margaret confessed she couldn't afford specialized parts, and Henry's limited resources wouldn't stretch far. Emily suggested they tap into community support. Maybe local folks would donate leftover materials or sponsor small costs. Rosewood County had always rallied around neighbors in need. Henry agreed, albeit with some hesitation. Asking for help wasn't something he did easily. But if it meant giving Margaret the chance to walk comfortably, he'd swallow his pride. As midnight approached, the trio realized they were on the cusp of something both daunting and exhilarating, a journey that blended old dreams, new knowledge, and the unwavering spirit of a small-town community. Over the next few days, news of Henry's prosthetic project spread across Rosewood County. Folks driving by the old Townsend garage saw the lights burning late into the night, curious shadows crossing the windows as Henry, Emily, and Margaret toiled. Before long, a trickle of visitors arrived with small donations, scrap metal, half-used tubes of industrial adhesive, or leftover PVC piping. One retired machinist named Arthur Gilmore brought a carefully packed crate of aluminum rods, proclaiming he'd been saving them for just the right cause. Another neighbor, Miss Doyle, offered home-cooked meals so the trio wouldn't have to stop working to eat. The local diner even put up a sign that read, "Support the Townsend Prosthetic Project because everyone deserves to walk in comfort." People left spare change in a jar by the cash register, and by the end of the week, they'd raised enough funds to order a few specialized parts Henry couldn't scrounge from salvage. In a county where money was tight and folks relied heavily on mutual aid, the support was both heartwarming and humbling. For Margaret, who had once felt so alone in her struggle, it was overwhelming to witness such unity. She found herself in the tears more than once, touched by the kindness of strangers who treated her like a friend. Amid this flurry of community involvement, Emily became the project's unofficial engineer in residence. She drafted updated designs, pulling from her coursework on biomechanics and mechanical stress. She recognized that while Henry's approach was intuitive and practical, modern engineering techniques could refine the prosthetics to reduce fatigue and ensure better weight distribution. Each evening after dinner, she would run simulations on her laptop, scribble improvements in a notebook, and consult with her grandfather on feasibility. Henry, meanwhile, provided the practical know-how. Sure, your computer says that hinge can take 100 pounds of force, but out here we gotta account for mud, ice, and real-life torque. He would remind her. Emily would grin, add an extra safety margin, and they'd move forward together. Margaret, for her part, lent insight from a user's perspective. She explained how certain sockets pinched her skin, or how a small misalignment in the knee joint could cause back pain after a full day of moving around. She also shared stories of her time in the classroom, how, after her accident, she tried to continue teaching chemistry, only to find the school building was woefully unaccommodating for someone in a wheelchair. The memory was bittersweet. She loved teaching, but the frustration of navigating narrow hallways and unsympathetic administrators pushed her into early retirement. Now, seeing the outpouring of support, she felt a renewed sense of belonging. As the design evolved, so did the bond among them. Henry discovered that Margaret possessed a sharp intellect. She'd studied some engineering concepts while improving her own prosthetic over the years, albeit in an ad hoc way. Emily admired Margaret's resilience, and the two women found themselves comparing notes on everything from mechanical leverage to life philosophies. Meanwhile, Henry quietly marveled at how fate had brought him exactly the kind of opportunity he'd yearned for decades ago. He still ached from old injuries, and he missed his wife and the closeness of his son. But in these late-night sessions, listening to the hum of an old radio, sipping coffee gone tepid, he felt a sense of renewed purpose. One night, just after midnight, they reached a milestone. The prototype frame was complete, a sturdy aluminum titanium blend hinge for the knee, a snug socket wrapped in soft but durable padding, and a modded hydraulic rod for controlled motion. It wasn't polished, but it stood upright on Henry's workbench like a testament to communal kindness and restless determination. Margaret wheeled closer, eyes shining. "Tomorrow," she whispered, placing a hand on Henry's shoulder. "Let's see if it'll help me stand." Henry, heart pounding with anticipation, simply nodded. Tomorrow, indeed, would be a day of revelation. The next morning, the garage hummed with quiet tension. Margaret settled onto an old wooden chair, removing her outdated prosthetic with a sense of both relief and apprehension. She glanced at the new device, which Henry and Emily carefully positioned on a padded stool. Though it was essentially a patchwork of donated parts and recycled materials, Margaret couldn't help but find it beautiful, like a symbol of second chances. Emily brought over her laptop, ready to record any data or observations. Henry hovered, arms folded, trying to mask his nervousness behind a calm facade. Slowly, they helped Margaret align her stump with the new socket. Emily had measured every dimension meticulously, but the true test would be how Margaret's body responded to the device's contours. As soon as Margaret's legs slipped in, she winced. There was an immediate pinch that none of the calculations had predicted. Henry cursed under his breath, rummaging for a wrench while Emily loosened the socket tension. They adjusted the angle by a few degrees, careful not to scratch Margaret's skin in the process. After the second attempt, Margaret let out a small laugh of surprise. It feels almost comfortable now," she said, blinking back emotion. But comfort in a static position was one thing. Bearing weight was another. Henry offered Margaret his arm, and Emily positioned herself on the other side. With a mixture of excitement and fear, Margaret gripped their arms and tried to stand. The first seconds were shaky, the hydraulic rod hissing softly as it engaged. Emily's eyes darted to the readouts on her laptop, but Henry ignored the screen. He was watching Margaret's face. She took a tentative step, the new knee bending in a slightly unnatural arc before stabilizing. Another step, then another. Her breath quickened, and a bead of sweat rolled down her temple. The garage fell silent except for the gentle clank of metal and the shuffle of Margaret's foot on the concrete floor. 5 steps in, the prosthetic suddenly locked mid-stride. Margaret lurched forward, nearly crashing into Henry. He caught her, bracing himself against the workbench. Emily gasped, checking the mechanism. The tension spring was misaligned, causing the hydraulic rod to jam. It wasn't a catastrophic failure, but it was enough to remind them how delicate this process was. Margaret, trembling from the near fall, exhaled shakily. "Let's fix it," she whispered, determination sparking in her eyes. For Henry, that moment was the difference between a fleeting attempt and a genuine commitment. Margaret wasn't giving up, and neither would he. They spent hours adjusting, testing, adjusting again. A small crowd gathered outside the garage, neighbors curious to see if the teacher from out of town could really walk on a homemade prosthetic. Margaret managed a sequence of 3 smooth steps before the knee stiffened again. Despite the repeated hiccups, each minor victory fueled the team's resolve. Emily noted each glitch methodically, then ran simulations on her battered laptop, searching for a solution to the lockup issue. Henry eyed the hydraulic rod suspiciously, wondering if a more precise component was needed. Margaret, sweaty and exhausted, refused to leave until she found a pattern of steps that felt natural, if only for a few strides. By sunset, they had gleaned enough data to refine the design. Margaret had managed roughly 20 steps total, some wobbly, some near falls, but a precious few that felt almost graceful. The townspeople who lingered offered encouragement applause for every successful step, sympathetic groans for every stumble. Although the prosthetic wasn't perfect yet, Henry felt an unmistakable surge of hope. The seeds of possibility were there. Margaret looked around at the gathering, tears in her eyes, and thanked everyone for believing in her. "We've still got a ways to go," Henry announced to the crowd, "but we'll get there, and when we do, she'll be walking like she never lost a step." The applause that followed was gentle, heartfelt, an affirmation that Rosewood County, despite its modest means, was capable of remarkable things when it stood together. As days turned into weeks, the garage transformed into a quasi-medical workshop, with shelves of spare car parts sharing space with plaster molds, silicone padding, and notes on joint articulation. Emily streamlined her design process, dividing it into small, testable increments so that each night they fixed a particular issue and each morning they evaluated how Margaret's leg responded. Henry tapped into old war buddy connections, calling a friend stationed at a VA hospital for advice on prosthetic fitting techniques. Sometimes, they'd gather in Henry's tiny office, hunched over speakerphone, listening intently to a specialist talk about residual limb volume changes and the need for adjustable sockets. Amid all this, a surprising development took shape. Margaret, who typically presented herself as reserved and cautious, began offering deeper insights that hinted at a strong engineering background. She'd speak matter-of-factly about torque differentials and friction coefficients, terms that usually didn't roll off the tongue of a retired chemistry teacher. Henry, initially too immersed in the project to question it, eventually asked, "You sure you only taught high school classes because you sound like you might have spent time in a lab or two?" Margaret shrugged, brushing it off with a vague remark about self-study. Emily's inquisitive mind sparked suspicion, but she let it lie for the moment. The breakthroughs were often small, measured in centimeters and degrees. One week, they'd conquer the problem of the prosthetic knee, locking mid-stride by incorporating a finer tension spring. The next, they'd discover an alignment tweak that drastically reduced Margaret's lower back strain. Each time they solved a snag, Margaret's confidence grew. She started taking strolls outside, pacing up and down the driveway in the crisp morning air. Passers-by cheered, some filming short clips that quickly circulated on local social media pages. The story of the homemade prosthetic gained modest fame, attracting folks from neighboring counties who wanted to see if Henry could replicate his success for other amputees. This newfound attention brought complications. A local journalist wrote an article for the county newspaper titled, "Mechanic and Teacher Team Up for Medical Miracle." While the piece was glowing and supportive, it caught the eye of certain parties with vested interests. Not long after, Henry found corporate brochures stuffed under the garage door from medical device manufacturers. A few included contact info, suggesting they might want to buy or license any new designs. Margaret grew nervous at the possibility of big companies swooping in. Emily, for her part, became fascinated by the idea that they might be onto something bigger than a one-time fix. One evening, Emily couldn't contain her curiosity anymore. After Margaret had gone to rest, she confronted Henry, brandishing a printout of an old patent filing. "I've been digging," she said, her voice laced with excitement. "There's a patent from 6 years ago for a low-cost prosthetic hinge. Guess who filed it, a Margaret Reed?" Henry looked at the document, stunned. "So she's, what, an inventor?" Emily nodded slowly. "It was never commercialized, but it's definitely her." Something clicked in Henry's mind. Margaret's uncanny knowledge, her reluctance to talk about her past, the subtle confidence in her suggestions. He felt both admiration and a hint of betrayal that she hadn't told them the whole truth. Still, he resolved not to confront her harshly. Maybe she had her reasons for secrecy. If anything, the revelation inspired him. They had a genuine collaborator in their midst, someone who wasn't just a passive recipient of help, but an expert who had faced obstacles. The next day, Henry approached Margaret gently. "Whenever you're ready," he told her. "I'd like to hear the whole story." She looked at him, eyes flickering with what might have been fear or relief, then nodded. "Soon," she promised. For now, Henry kept her secret, hoping that when she finally opened up, they'd find an even stronger sense of purpose in what they were building together. Before Margaret could confess her full story, an unexpected tragedy brought the project and the entire town to a standstill. Late one afternoon, a massive storm swept across Rosewood County. Fierce winds felled trees and power lines, and torrential rain turned dirt roads into rivers of mud. Henry had seen bad weather before, but this time felt different. The local radio station crackled with alerts of possible tornado conditions. People scrambled to secure their homes. Farmers rushed to herd livestock. Emily and Margaret helped Henry barricade the garage windows, stacking tires and wooden boards in a hasty effort to protect the precious equipment inside. Just as the storm reached its peak fury, Henry remembered old Mr. Carmichael, a widower who lived alone on the far side of the county in a rickety farmhouse. Word was he'd been unwell, and Henry worried he might be trapped if the roads washed out. Despite Emily and Margaret's protests, Henry insisted on driving his weather-beaten pickup out to check on him. He told them to stay put, that he'd be back within an hour. Armed with a flashlight and a toolkit, he ventured into the gale, leaving two worried faces behind in the dimly lit garage. The sky flickered with jagged forks of lightning, and the wind howled like a living thing, buffeting the truck from side to side. Henry navigated potholes that had turned into mini lakes, nearly swerving off the road more than once. By the time he reached Mr. Carmichael's property, fallen branches blocked the driveway. He hiked the last 100 yards on foot, rain pounding his face, only to find the old man huddled on his porch, too terrified to move. The roof had partially collapsed under the weight of a hopped oak tree. Henry managed to guide Mr. Carmichael into the truck, racing back toward the main town road. All the while, Emily and Margaret waited in tense silence. The storm raged outside, but it was the sense of helplessness that gnawed at them. Margaret repeatedly checked the weather updates on her phone, her fingers trembling. Emily paced, chewing on her nails. After 2 hours, the howling wind began to subside, and a distant siren wailed. A trickle of relief ran through them if the sirens were out. It meant emergency services were operational, and perhaps Henry wasn't far behind. Finally, headlights cut through the darkness. Henry's pickup rumbled back into the garage lot, splattered with mud and branches jammed into the grill. Emily rushed out, frantically pulling the passenger door open to find Mr. Carmichael safe. Though shaken, Henry, soaked to the bone, was nursing a gash on his forehead where a branch had smashed through the window. He brushed off offers of medical help, saying, "I've had worse. Let's just get this man warm and dry." Margaret insisted on cleaning Henry's wound while Emily arranged a cot for Mr. Carmichael to rest on. As she dabbed antiseptic on Henry's forehead, Margaret's hands shook. "You're too old for this hero stuff," she scolded softly, tears brimming in her eyes. Henry chuckled, wincing at the sting of iodine. "A man's got to do what's right," he whispered. The words hung in the air, weighted with the simple truth of his character. For a moment, their gazes locked, and Margaret saw something in Henry's weary, determined eyes, a reflection of the selfless dedication she'd always craved in her own life. That night, as they all huddled in the dim garage, the storm gradually passed, leaving behind scattered debris and a renewed sense that every day was precious, that the lines we draw between ourselves and others can vanish when we truly care. With Rosewood County reeling from the storm's aftermath, the prosthetic project slowed. Roads needed clearing, power lines had to be repaired, and Henry spent his days helping neighbors patch roofs and haul debris. Margaret, however, felt an urgency to press onward. Her near panic during Henry's absence underscored how deeply she had grown to value him, and by extension, the mission they shared. One evening, she found him alone in the garage, stooped over the partial shell of a tractor engine he'd promised to fix for a local farmer. After hesitating for a moment, Margaret wheeled closer and quietly said, "Henry, I owe you the truth." He switched off the small lamp he was using, turning to face her in the hush of the garage, overshadowed by a fading sunset. She confessed her full story. She wasn't just a high school chemistry teacher. Years ago, she had been a lead researcher for a renowned medical device company, TheraBio Solutions, founded by her father. She'd spearheaded the design of low-cost prosthetics after seeing how many wounded soldiers returned from overseas with limited options. But internal politics, profit-driven boards, and a family dispute over corporate direction drove her away. When she lost her leg in a car accident, her father's company offered her a top-tier prosthetic at no cost on the condition that she remain their public face for marketing. Outraged by the commodification of her disability, she refused, severing ties and retreating from the medical engineering world. Henry listened in near silence, pieces of the puzzle snapping into place. Margaret's patent, her advanced technical suggestions, her anxious reaction to corporate brochures, everything now made sense. She also explained that after leaving TheraBio, she took a teaching job in a rural district, finding solace in educating young minds. But budget cuts and physical barriers made her final years in the classroom an uphill battle. After that, she tried living on her modest savings and disability checks, but the cost of a decent prosthetic soared beyond her reach, and pride stopped her from seeking her father's help. Her eyes brimmed with tears as she recalled feeling abandoned both by her family and a system that valued profit over people. Henry reached out, placing a calloused hand over hers. "I understand why you kept quiet," he said, his voice sincere. "Sometimes trusting people is hard when you've been burned." Margaret nodded, relief and a glimmer of hope washing over her. "I didn't want to overshadow your dream. Henry, you started this project from the goodness of your heart. And I was afraid if you knew who I was, you'd think I was using you." In the stillness that followed, Henry inhaled deeply. He thought of the worn sketches he once drew in a battered notebook, the unfulfilled dream of giving veterans a chance to live with dignity. "We have the same goal," he said simply, "and it's bigger than either of us alone. If you're willing to keep working with me, let's make this prosthetic the first of many, for whoever needs it, no matter their bank account." A teary smile broke across Margaret's face. "Thank you," she whispered. That night, under flickering fluorescent bulbs, the two worked side by side, fine-tuning the knee joint and adjusting the socket. There was a silent communion between them now, no longer just teacher and mechanic, but two dreamers who had confronted heartbreak in their separate worlds, coming together to craft a new reality. The unfolding success of Margaret's prosthetic soon began attracting outside attention once more, this time from individuals who genuinely needed help. A Vietnam veteran named Roy arrived from 3 towns over. Having heard rumors of a mechanic who made legs out of leftover steel, He'd lost his own leg decades ago, surviving on a low-grade prosthetic supplied by a strapped VA system. Though he was initially skeptical, "What's a rural grease monkey gonna do for me?" That Uncle Sam couldn't, he reportedly quipped. His attitude shifted the moment Henry and Emily greeted him with genuine warmth and honest talk about materials and constraints. Within days, Roy was joined by a young mother named Carla from a neighboring county who had lost part of her leg in an industrial accident. She'd been struggling with cheaply made prosthetics that caused her constant pain. Word spread rapidly that Henry Townsend and his team were building functional, comfortable prosthetics at a fraction of the standard cost. They asked no big corporate fees, only requesting enough to cover materials or, in some cases, nothing at all if the person couldn't afford it. The community rallied once again, setting up rotating volunteer schedules to accommodate the influx of visitors. Carpools formed to bring potential patients. Local churches organized potluck dinners, and the small diner across the street extended its hours to feed out-of-towners. Margaret and Emily took detailed measurements of each new visitor, compiling a makeshift database on Emily's laptop. Emily devised a modular approach so that prosthetic parts could be swapped or adjusted as needed, allowing a broader range of fits without crafting an entire new leg each time. Margaret provided clinical expertise gleaned from her years in medical device R&D to tailor designs for each individual's unique circumstances. Henry, still juggling normal car repairs, found himself working late into the night to keep up with the demand. He replaced more than a few brake pads by day, then meticulously assembled prosthetic joints by night. Though exhausted, he felt deeply alive, a sense of mission he'd never truly experienced, not even during his time in the service. Inevitably, the surge in activity caught the attention of the TheraBio Solutions Board, especially once they realized that their founder's own daughter was behind this grassroots effort. A local representative discreetly tried to contact Margaret, offering to collaborate on the project. Margaret, wary of their motives, refused to make any agreements without Henry's blessing. She knew TheraBio's track record, big marketing budgets, high profit margins, and a willingness to patent lock essential medical innovations. Meanwhile, a rumor swirled that TheraBio might attempt to replicate Henry's designs and mass-produce them at a low cost overseas. The notion sparked a quiet panic among the small community of volunteers. Would all their meticulous, heartfelt work be co-opted by a giant corporation? On a chilly afternoon, Margaret and Henry sat on a bench outside the garage, watching Roy test out his new leg with a hesitant smile. "We can't keep this a secret forever," Margaret mused, rubbing her arms for warmth. "If TheraBio or some other big company wants to move in, they will, and we might not be able to stop them legally." Henry nodded grimly, recalling how corporate influence often steamrolled local efforts. "We might need to go public first," he suggested. Surprising her, he explained that if they announced their methods openly, distributing design plans, partnering with local hospitals, and ensuring patents remain in friendly hands, they could ensure the blueprint remained a public resource. Margaret's eyes lit up. Perhaps that was the path to safeguarding their dream: radical transparency and a coalition built on shared compassion rather than profit. Leaning on each other, they silently resolved to fight for the right of every amputee to have a safe, affordable prosthetic, no matter how large the opposition grew. Determined to broaden their impact, Henry and Margaret began orchestrating a community showcase, a modest event held in Rosewood County's fairgrounds, complete with folding chairs, a makeshift stage, and a borrowed microphone system. The idea was simple: they would display the various prosthetics they'd created, allow real users like Roy and Carla to demonstrate how well they worked, and publicly release basic design schematics. Emily spent hours compiling a digital presentation, ensuring she omitted any specific proprietary details that might give TheraBio a legal edge. Still, the core engineering principles: hinge structures, hydraulic calibrations, modular sockets would be open for anyone to examine. As the day of the showcase approached, local excitement mounted. Farmers who had never given a second thought to medical devices offered their barns as additional exhibit space if needed. The school's marching band volunteered to perform an uplifting medley. Even the mayor, A portly man known more for his love of barbecue than legislative prowess, promised to say a few words of support. Meanwhile, Margaret's father, Ronald Reed, unexpectedly reached out via email. He wanted to attend incognito, claiming he simply wanted to see his daughter's work firsthand. Margaret was torn. She had not spoken to him in years. Henry advised her to keep an open mind, but remain cautious. On the morning of the event, the fairgrounds bustled with anticipation. Rows of picnic tables were lined with homemade pies, sandwiches, and lemonade. Emily helped Roy attach a microphone to his shirt so he could describe his experience learning to walk again with a Townsend Reed prosthetic. Carla stood by, balancing on her new limb with surprising ease as she fidgeted in front of an audience she never dreamed she'd address. Margaret supervised the final audio checks, trying not to glance too often at the crowd for signs of her father's arrival. Henry paced behind the stage. A bundle of nerves. Public speaking wasn't his forte, and the stakes felt impossibly high. When the showcase began, everything proceeded like a carefully choreographed dance. Roy told of years struggling with ill-fitting prosthetics that rubbed his stump raw, and the skepticism he felt until he met Henry. Carla recounted the emotional trauma of losing her leg in an accident, followed by the frustration of subpar medical equipment. Each testimonial ended on a hopeful note, emphasizing how the Townsend Reed approach combined local craftsmanship, modern engineering, and personal empathy. The crowd applauded vigorously, some wiping away tears at stories of regained mobility and dignity. Margaret took the stage, voice quavering with emotion as she presented the open-source schematics. A projector displayed the simpler mechanical drawings that Emily had carefully curated, disclaimers and references included. "We're sharing this," Margaret announced, "because we believe no one should be denied the chance to stand, walk, or run simply because they lack money or insurance." In the front row, Henry noticed a tall, silver-haired man with a solemn expression, eyes glistening. Margaret hadn't spotted him yet, but Henry guessed this must be Ronald Reed. As she concluded, the fairgrounds erupted in cheers. Margaret stepped down, breathless, tears threatening to break free. Henry gave her a gentle hug, then stepped up to speak a few words. He was no orator, just a mechanic who knew the pain of wanting to help but lacking the means. Gazing at the sea of faces, he said simply, "We do this because it's right. That's it. That's the whole reason." He felt the hush of understanding ripple through the crowd. Sometimes the simplest truths resonate the most. And in that hush, Margaret looked up to see her father standing in the back, hands clasped, as if he too understood for the first time what truly mattered. The day after the showcase, TheraBio Solutions launched an aggressive campaign to discredit the Townsend Reed prosthetics, claiming in a press release that the homemade devices lacked professional vetting and could pose severe risks to users if incorrectly fitted. Corporate-sponsored ads appeared online, questioning whether a rural mechanic could produce medical-grade technology. The timing was no coincidence. The success of the community showcase had evidently rattled them. Despite the negative spin, Rosewood County's tight-knit community rallied. Users like Roy and Carla posted heartfelt video testimonials explaining how well the prosthetics worked for them. The local newspaper published a rebuttal, praising the meticulous safety checks Henry and Emily performed and the supportive, hands-on approach Margaret contributed. Public opinion in the region largely sided with Townsend Reed, but outside Rosewood, TheraBio's clout loomed like a storm cloud. Larger media outlets, swayed by corporate sponsorship, remained skeptical of the garage-made limbs. In the midst of the PR battle, a more personal drama was unfolding. Margaret's father, Ronald, lingered in town under the guise of tourism, secretly meeting with potential investors who saw potential in the Townsend Reed designs. While Margaret was suspicious, she found herself conflicted by her father's renewed attention. Ronald came to the garage one afternoon, stirring old ghosts. Margaret was in the midst of calibrating a new socket for a teenage girl, Lucy, who had lost her leg to cancer. Lucy's mother anxiously watched the process, but Margaret's calm voice and steady hands soon quelled her worries. Ronald stood quietly, observing his daughter's gentle rapport with Lucy. After Lucy and her mother left, Ronald approached Margaret, an unspoken apology in his eyes. He admitted he regretted how profit motives overshadowed their original philanthropic goals at Therabio. "I lost sight of what mattered," he said in a subdued tone. Margaret listened, arms folded, her face unreadable. Henry observed from a distance, resisting the urge to intervene. This was a private dance between a father and daughter who had once shared a dream but ended up on opposite sides of a corporate battlefield. Eventually, Ronald cleared his throat. "I met with some potential backers," he confessed, "people who might be open to a nonprofit approach. Maybe we can produce these prosthetics at scale, keep them affordable, and maintain the open source model. It doesn't have to be like before." Margaret's eyes flickered with caution, the memory of broken promises clearly still fresh. "If you want to help, you do it our way," she replied. "Transparency, local involvement, user feedback. No burying data for profit, no locking out improvements." "Agreed." Ronald hesitated, then slowly nodded, a hint of remorse twisting his features. That evening, Margaret confided in Henry. She wanted to believe her father's intentions were genuine, but the scars ran deep. Henry reminded her that forging trust was like fine-tuning a prosthetic. It took trial, error, and adjustment. At the same time, Therabio's growing hostility meant they might need allies with resources. Emily chimed in with youthful pragmatism. "We can't fight a giant corporation alone, but if we have a bigger platform and distribution chain, we can help so many more people on our terms." As the team weighed the risks and rewards, Therabio filed an injunction, claiming Townsend Reed's design infringed on certain medical device patents. Legal documents arrived by courier, thick envelopes bristling with threats of lawsuits. The sight rattled them all, but Henry, despite his rusticated ways, remained steadfast. "Let them come," he said, brow furrowed with quiet resolve. "We'll fight them with the truth, and we won't stand down." Margaret nodded, but in her gut, she felt the tension of a bigger battle ahead. Rosewood County might have the heart, but Therabio had the lawyers, the money, and the power. The legal standoff escalated quickly. Therabio's attorneys accused Townsend Reed of violating half a dozen patents, which Margaret recognized as a standard corporate tactic: throw every possible claim at the smaller party to force a costly legal defense. Ronald Reed intervened, partially, offering to use his connections and personal funds to hire a reputable law firm for Townsend Reed. Margaret was torn. She disliked relying on her father's wealth, but they had few options otherwise. Henry and Emily, both trusting Margaret's judgment, deferred to her in deciding whether to accept Ronald's help. After several sleepless nights, she relented, opting to use whatever means necessary to ensure they didn't lose their work to a false infringement claim. A wave of court filings, depositions, and technical arguments ensued, leaving Henry feeling like a fish out of water. He found solace in the garage, trying to keep up with the real reason they were here, building prosthetics for people in need. Whenever the stress got too high, he'd step outside, breathe in the country air, and remind himself that no fancy lawsuit could destroy the intangible good they'd already accomplished in Rosewood County. Margaret, meanwhile, had to revisit old designs from her time at Therabio to prove their new prototypes were substantially different. Emily, in a surprising display of resourcefulness, combed through public databases to uncover older, expired patents that could invalidate Therabio's claims. As the legal case ground on, the small community around them refused to let hope die. Lucy, the teenager battling cancer, kept showing up for fittings, bringing homemade cookies to cheer up the group. Roy and Carla organized a fundraiser, inviting musicians from nearby towns to play a benefit concert in the garage. They raised more than enough to cover incremental legal fees. But more importantly, it was an emotional boost. The concert turned into a celebration of resilience, neighbors laughing, dancing, and clapping, as if to say, we won't be bullied into silence. Margaret watched from the sidelines that night, feeling a swelling of pride and determination. Then, near the workshop entrance, she spotted a figure in a crisp suit, her father, Ronald. He stood awkwardly, out of place among the jubilant crowd. But there was a glimmer in his eyes like he recognized something he'd lost in the corporate boardrooms. He approached Margaret to share some news. The negotiations with their prospective nonprofit backers were going well. If Townsend Reed could survive the lawsuit, there would be significant funding available to scale their open-source prosthetic model. Yet, Margaret's anxiety flared when Ronald mentioned a condition the backers wanted a seat on the new nonprofit board, and they wanted Henriette out of daily production to focus on public relations. They believed a more polished representative would attract donors. Margaret seethed. Henry was the soul of the operation. Removing him from the workshop would be like ripping the engine out of a car. Ronald defended the idea, claiming it was standard procedure, but Margaret refused to budge. She walked away, her mind made up if they had to choose between Henry's authentic leadership or a big donor with strings attached. She'd pick Henry every time. That night, after the benefit concert ended and the last guests drifted away, the Townsend garage felt impossibly quiet. Emily had dozed off on a pile of blankets in the corner, and Henry was methodically cleaning wrenches. Margaret approached him gently, explaining what her father had told her. Henry paused in mid-wipe, a crease forming between his brows. Without skipping a beat, he said, "We don't compromise who we are. We might lose money, but we'll keep our integrity. I'm not going to parade around fancy offices while good folks wait for a leg to stand on." In that instant, Margaret knew exactly where she stood. This was the man she'd trust with her dream, her heart, and her life's work, even if the entire corporate world turned against them. In a surprising twist, the legal confrontation with Therabio never reached the courtroom. On the eve of the hearing, the Townsend Reed legal team presented newly discovered patent evidence, courtesy of Emily's research, that predated Therabio's claims. This effectively invalidated Therabio's key infringement arguments. Embarrassed by the weakness of their case and wary of public backlash, Therabio withdrew the lawsuit, issuing a lukewarm statement about pursuing other avenues to innovate. Cheers erupted throughout Rosewood County when the news broke. Fireworks left over from a past 4th of July celebration lit up the evening ski. Henry, not one for grand displays, simply breathed a sigh of relief and thanked the townspeople who had stood by them. Margaret, for the first time in years, felt a deep sense of vindication, no longer overshadowed by corporate intimidation. She and Henry could focus on the real work, refining and expanding their prosthetic designs. Still, the dilemma of scaling up remained. Ronald Reed's negotiations for a nonprofit arm had reached a pivotal moment. The potential donors were on board. Provided Henry took a more ceremonial role, Margaret adamantly refused. But Henry, in an unexpected move, asked to meet the donors personally, traveling with Margaret and Emily to a nearby city. In a cramped conference room, they faced a handful of sharp-eyed philanthropists. Each one had a stake in medical charities or philanthropic organizations. When asked why he wouldn't step aside for a professional manager, Henry told a simple story of how he once fixed a young boy's leg brace using leftover car parts. He explained that the personal, hands-on connection was essential to ensuring empathy guided their designs. "If we're going to do right by the people we serve," Henry concluded, "we have to keep our hearts and our hands in the work." The donors exchanged glances, clearly moved. Perhaps they had grown used to polished executives pitching them figures and statistics. Henry's unrefined sincerity struck a chord. In the end, the donors offered a compromise. They would fund a pilot production facility in Rosewood County as a Townsend Reed collaborative, with Henry remaining the lead designer but assisted by a small administrative team to handle marketing and grants. No one would be forced out. Margaret and Emily beamed. "Ronald, standing off to the side, nodded in agreement, relieved that his daughter and Henry were no longer at risk of losing everything. Returning to the garage that evening, they found the entire town awaiting their news. When Margaret announced the result, a fully funded pilot program that preserved Henry's role, cheers filled the night air. The local church bells rang, and a spontaneous celebration erupted. Roy proclaimed, "This is what small-town guts and big hearts can do." Carla twirled on her prosthetic leg as if practicing a dance routine. Lucy, the teenager, clapped along with the crowd, bright-eyed with excitement for her future. In that swirl of applause, Henry caught Margaret's gaze, and they shared a look that spoke volumes about shared hardship, trust, and a quiet kind of love that had been growing unannounced. Later, after the crowd dispersed, Henry and Margaret leaned against a stack of tires behind the garage, the scent of warm asphalt and fresh hay drifting on the summer breeze. "We did it," Margaret whispered, her eyes reflecting the glow of the single overhead bulb. Henry gently took her hand. "I reckon there was still more to do," he replied softly, but a grin tugged at his lips. They both knew that while the fight wasn't over, the path ahead was finally clear, and they would walk it together, step by step. A few months later, the Townsend Reed Collaborative was bustling with new faces and renewed energy. The old garage had been partially renovated to accommodate advanced equipment, though Henry insisted they keep the original sign Townsend Auto and Repairs as a nod to tradition. A larger annex had been constructed on the adjacent lot, filled with rows of 3D printers, CNC machines, and testing rigs for prosthetic joints. Emily oversaw much of the technical setup, reveling in the practical application of her engineering coursework. She was no longer just a student on spring break. She was a project lead, proving that generational knowledge and modern science could intersect beautifully. Workers arrived from neighboring counties, each with a unique skill, some specialized in metal fabrication, others in silicone casting or software modeling. A local seamstress joined to stitch custom liners. 3 new interns from a regional college took on daily tasks like data entry and inventory management. Meanwhile, Margaret received an offer to formally join a national medical symposium, presenting their open-source prosthetic designs. The acceptance letter arrived on a crisp autumn morning, prompting an outbreak of celebratory shouts in the workshop. At the heart of this operation stood Henry, still wearing his grease-stained overalls, quietly ensuring that none of the progress overshadowed the personal connection with users. He insisted on meeting every new patient face-to-face, listening to their stories, and personally taking measurements whenever possible. He collaborated with clinicians who volunteered time from a local hospital to oversee medical safety, bridging the gap between Henry's mechanical genius and medical best practices. The synergy was remarkable. Production was steadily increasing, while individual care remained intact. On a crisp Sunday, Henry decided to finally retire the battered old pickup he'd driven for decades, replacing it with a new truck, courtesy of the philanthropic donors. Yet, he couldn't bring himself to scrap the old one, so he parked it under a tin roof beside the garage as a kind of monument. "That truck's been with me through storms and triumphs," he joked. "It deserves a rest." The same could be said for Henry, who, despite the bustling environment, felt tired in his bones. He scheduled a doctor's visit for lingering pain in his knees pain that had grown more insistent over the past months, a reminder of his own mortality. Margaret, noticing Henry's growing discomfort, gently prodded him to seek better medical advice. She even teased that one day he might need a Townsend Reed knee brace if his condition worsened. He smirked but didn't dismiss the idea. Deep down, he understood he was not young, and the weight of leadership, combined with the physical demands of his trade, was taking its toll. Yet he felt a deep contentment. "I'd do it all over again," he confided in Margaret one evening, as they locked up the workshop. "We've given folks a chance to walk. That's worth any ache and pain I've got." The next morning, Henry arrived to find the new building's foyer adorned with photos of current patients, Lucy hiking a nearby trail, Roy saluting the American flag with a sturdy stance, Carla pushing her toddler on a swing without stumbling. Each face was a testament to the difference Townsend Reed was making. The sense of pride Henry felt eclipsed any corporate plaque or fancy title. And in the corner of the foyer, a small plaque read, "Dedicated to the people of Rosewood County, because everyone deserves to stand tall." For Henry, that said everything. On a brisk winter evening, long after the sun had dipped below the rolling hills of Rosewood County, the Townsend Reed Collaborative threw open its doors to celebrate its first anniversary. Fairy lights sparkled around the renovated garage and the new annex, forming a glowing constellation that guided visitors in from the chilly darkness. Car after car pulled up, occupying makeshift parking areas along the road. Some visitors came to share stories of regained mobility. Others arrived simply to applaud the extraordinary achievements of their neighbors. A few curious folks from out of state had traveled a great distance, drawn by the legend of a small-town mechanic and an enigmatic former researcher who built prosthetics out of scraps. The interior of the annex was buzzing with laughter and conversation. Tables had been set up with hearty casseroles, homemade pies, and bowls of steaming stew. Emily, bouncing between guests, introduced them to new prototypes on display, a specialized running blade for track athletes, a heavy-duty model for construction workers, and a refined cosmetic shell for those who wanted a more natural appearance. Each design told a story of collaboration between engineering, user feedback, and that essential Townsend craftsman's touch. Near the main stage, Margaret stood next to her father, Ronald. The tension between them softened over months of cooperative effort. He had largely kept his promise, funneling resources and corporate expertise without overshadowing Henry's leadership or Margaret's vision. They watched as Lucy, dressed in a sparkly holiday outfit, bounded onto the stage to demonstrate a short dance routine. The audience broke into applause, tears glistening in many eyes. Roy, leaning on a cane for balance but standing tall, offered Lucy a mock bow. The pair then invited Carla, who waltzed out with her toddler in her arms, weaving through the small crowd with relative ease. This improvised pageant of movement was a living illustration of what Townsend Reed had accomplished. In one corner, Henry stood quietly, a gentle grin playing across his weathered face. He soaked in the scene, the swirl of families hugging, the giddy excitement of children who now saw prosthetics as something that could be cool, not a life sentence. Margaret approached him, slipping her arm through his. "You're missing the best part," she teased, gesturing toward the stage. But he shook his head. "Nah," he murmured, voice thick with emotion. "I'm seeing exactly what I dreamed about. Just took me a lifetime to get here." The lights dimmed, and Emily took the microphone, thanking everyone for their unwavering support. Then, with eyes twinkling, she announced a surprise in honor of the man who started it all. "We have a special dedication." She unveiled a bronze plaque featuring Henry's name alongside Margaret's, set to be mounted at the entrance of the new annex. It read, "Townsend Reed Collaborative, where compassion meets ingenuity." The crowd erupted in cheers, but Henry, heart pounding, felt tears prick his eyes. Before he could speak, Margaret leaned up to kiss his cheek. "You deserve this," she whispered. As applause thundered, Henry finally cleared his throat and stepped forward, removing his worn cap. He began, then paused, taking in the sight of so many grateful faces. This building, these prosthetics, they aren't about me or Margaret or any one person. They're about all of us, everyone who gave a few dollars, or their time, or just believed in the impossible. He looked around, catching Ronald's nod of approval, Emily's bright smile, Roy's respectful salute, Carla's tearful grin, and Lucy's energetic wave. "I reckon we proved that even an old mechanic and a mismatched crew can make a difference when they don't give up on each other." The crowd clapped harder, and Henry added with a soft smile, "Here's to standing tall together." Snow started to fall outside, blanketing the fairgrounds in a serene hush. The golden lights from the Townsend Reed Collaborative cast a warm glow through the swirling flakes. Inside, a heartfelt chorus of well-wishers surrounded Henry and Margaret, neighbors, friends, beneficiaries of their prosthetic designs. In the small foyer, next to images of all the people now walking freely, stood that original prototype, a simple metal frame made from salvaged rods and an old tractor cylinder, a piece of history that bore witness to the power of second chances and shared dreams. And so, with the hush of winter settling over Rosewood County, the promise of the Townsend Reed legacy shone bright, a beacon for every soul longing to stand and walk on their own terms. Looking back, the path taken wasn't easy. It never is when dreams collide with reality, when small-town courage stands face-to-face with corporate might. Along the way, something precious was reclaimed, not just the ability to walk or stand, but dignity, community, and trust. In the quiet of a humble garage, hearts mended alongside machines, and second chances emerged from scraps and hope. Yet nothing meaningful comes without sacrifice. There were battles fought that left scars unseen, late nights filled with uncertainty, and moments when fear whispered louder than courage. Pride was humbled, past wounds reopened, and relationships tested. But through it all, resilience was forged, piece by painstaking piece, until strength was born from vulnerability, and the promise of tomorrow outweighed the shadows of yesterday. Now, as the lights dim and quiet returns to Rosewood County, a question remains, a gentle echo carried by the evening breeze. What defines us? Is it our successes, our hardships, or perhaps the courage we show in bridging them both? Perhaps our true legacy isn't found in what we build, but in the lives we touch along the way. Maybe, just maybe, we're all mechanics of the human spirit, mending broken pieces until they become whole again. And you, when the storm comes in your dreams, hang by a thread, will you find within yourself the strength to rebuild, to stand once more, and reclaim what truly matters?